Great. Well, I think we'll make a start. Maybe one or two will join us as we get going. Let me start with asking you, as I often do, a question. What's the earliest that you've ever got up in the morning? And what was it for? You know, often we don't tend to get up super early, do we? If we can help it. I know some do, but they're often few and far between. And usually, if we are setting the alarm to get up super early, that's something that happens occasionally in our lives, and it happens for a very, very good reason. Usually it's either firstly because there's something that we just have to do. Maybe we have to pick someone up from the airport. Maybe we have to walk the dog before work. Maybe we have to get to our place of work for an early shift. We can get up super early in the morning because of things that we have to do. But there's another reason why you might set your alarm super early in the morning. And that's because there is something you really want to do. Maybe it's go on holiday. Maybe we have this when we've taken teams over to Nepal because you want to see the sun come up on the Himalayas. Some of us have had that experience. When we take teams over to Nepal, we have an opportunity to hike up to a local hilltop, sleep in a hotel up on the hilltop, and we get up before dawn to go up to a viewing point in order to see the Himalayas at dawn. Maybe it's because you want to watch the Lions play Australia live when the game is taking place in Australia. I might be doing some of that over the summer. Last week we looked at a day in the life of Jesus, a 12-hour period on a Sabbath day, which started with the weekly gathering in the synagogue and ended with what you might call a mini revival on the doorstep of Simon Peter's house. I mean, quite a day, an extraordinary day of kingdom breakthrough. We're going to pick up the story early, and it is early, the very next morning. So we're going to read from Mark chapter 1. If you have a Bible with you, don't worry too much. The words will be up on the screen behind me. In verse 35. And rising very early, say very early, the next in the morning, while it was still dark, he departed, that's Jesus, and went out to a desolate place. And there he prayed. And Simon and those who were with him searched for him. And they found him. And they said to him, "Everyone is looking for you." And he said to them, "Let's go on to the next towns, that I may preach there also. For that's why I came out." And he went throughout all Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and casting out demons. Here we have Mark's account of what happened on the morning after the mini revival of the day before. It's a fascinating little incident that Mark is very careful to record for us. And if you remember, the probability is that Mark is getting his account from the eyewitness record of Simon Peter, who is central, of course, in this account. And so considers this so significant that it needs to be included within his very short gospel account. Mark's not trying to just pad out his account with word count here. Everything is there for a reason. It's there because it is considered significant. And here we have a fascinating window into a significant incident that Simon Peter remembers so clearly. I wonder if any of you have heard of the Pando tree. The pando tree grows in Utah in the USA, and it is famous for having the most extensive root system of any tree. In fact, what appears to be a whole forest of trees is actually a whole bunch of shoots springing up from the same rootstock that is underneath the surface of the soil. Apparently, a single pando tree can have around 47,000 stems which appear as individual trees, but are in fact, as I've said, shoots springing up from a massive underground root system that apparently can cover over 100 acres. Think about that. That's about the size, I think, of the whole of Fleming Park, including the golf course, or the whole of Hilliers Arboretum, a single rootstock underneath the soil. Apparently, one of these rootstocks is considered to be the world's largest living single organism, the pando tree. Well, here we have in Mark's Gospel a look under the surface of the ministry and mission of Jesus into the substantial, extensive, deep rootstock of his relationship with the Father. Mark 1, verse 21 to 34 that we looked at last week describes the dramatic, spectacular, public ministry and mission of Jesus. And we saw that it's marked by three things: teaching, healing, and deliverance. Here, however, we go underneath the surface, and we discover that beneath the surface of Jesus' powerful, dramatic, impactful mission and ministry is a deep, extensive commitment to time alone with the Father. That's what we're going to consider this morning. This is something so important to Jesus, so vital, that after an exhausting day of ministry and mission, he is up out of the warmth of his bed while it is still dark, and he is sneaking off to a secret place so that he can be alone in prayer with the Father. Prayer, Samuel Chadwick said, is the acid test of devotion. Robert Murray McCheyne says that a man or woman is what he is on his or her knees in prayer and nothing more. What counts is not what we appear to be before other people in public. As we go about mission and ministry, but what we truly are in private before God alone in prayer. It's not the impressive branches. It's not the spectacular, exciting fruit. It is the depth and extent of the root system of your Christian life that really matters. In fact, one depends on the other. Now, if you're sitting there and your heart is beginning to sink a bit, and you are steeling yourself for a good dose of guilt because, oh, here it comes, here's the annual message on prayer, I want to encourage you this morning to keep an open heart. You see, the reality is none of us feels like we've got the prayer life that we aspire to have. I know I certainly don't. None of us. And so if you're sitting there with a sinking feeling of guilt, looking around, thinking, oh, wish I had their prayer life, I want to encourage you. We are all in the same boat. We all have very big L plates and will always have very big L plates when it comes to the practice of prayer. But it's important. Time alone with the Father. This is about the cultivation of our relationship with God. And that's not something we can quantify or measure, is it? I mean, you know when you are enjoying relational intimacy, and you know, hopefully, when it's absent. But it's not something that can be measured. It's not something that you can put on a sliding scale. You cannot map relationship onto a spreadsheet. Doesn't work like that. I mean, take marriage, for example. You can have a sense that your marriage is growing and that there is a deepening sense of togetherness and intimacy and what you might describe as a relational familiarity. But I tell you, there's still an awful lot of mystery there, isn't there? There's still some surprises. Apparently, it took my mum 30 years to discover that my dad didn't like cauliflower. 30 years of marriage. I tell you, there's still some surprises. Here we find that underneath the apparent success of his public mission and ministry, Jesus expresses a deep commitment to cultivating relationship with God through time alone with his Father. Simon Peter's very careful, if he is the oral source of this Gospel of Mark, to ensure that this gets written down, this gets included. Mark, you need to include this. So let's take a look beneath the surface then of Jesus' ministry and mission as we consider these three verses. Three simple things I think that we can observe here. First of all, this is all about devotion. This is not Jesus getting up super early in the morning because he's got some kind of religious requirement to fulfill. Because there's going to be a whole bunch of people there wondering where Jesus is. And, I suppose I better get up and do this religious thing and tick this religious box. This is not because he has to clock in a certain amount of time in prayer before the day begins. There we are, it's done. There's my 15 minutes. I can get on with my day now. No, no, no. This is not about duty. This is about devotion. And they are two very different things. Duty is doing things that we feel we have to do, but we don't really want to do. Put the bins out. Get to the office on time. Fill in your tax returns. Wash the car. Devotion is doing things out of a deep sense of desire. That's what's going on here. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not an element of discipline. I'm afraid there is. You see, no one feels like leaping out of bed at 4:30 in the morning. But if there is something that you really desire, it's a decision that you make willingly, gladly, rather than coercively or reluctantly. Do you understand? There's a little equation that I found helpful thinking about this. Desire that we add discipline to ends up in delight. And so if we want the delight that is the ultimate delight, which is time alone with the Father, which is that sense of relational intimacy with the God who made us, the God who knows us like no one else knows us. True delight, the ultimate delight. If we desire that and we add discipline to that desire, we end up experiencing that delight. That's what's going on here. And so desire is an internal thing. intrinsic, if you like. That's very different to this other equation. Duty, discipline, disdain. Let me explain that one. Duty is when we are driven by a sense of what we have to do, and also at times being coerced into something. And if we then do the thing that we feel that we have to do, or that we're being coerced into doing, we end up resentful, and if we're not careful, rebellious. We get to the point where we say to ourselves, you know what, I've had enough. We're not doing the things that we're doing because we're driven by desire. We're doing them because we feel like we just have to do these things, or there's some external coercion that's going on. Welcome to religion. Welcome to religion. This is not religion. This is Jesus with a deep desire to enjoy what he's enjoyed for all eternity, which is the ultimate delight of intimacy with his Father, adding to it discipline, getting up before dawn, and being alone with his Father. Jesus is not doing his duty here. He's expressing his devotion. We looked at how the picture of a bridegroom and bride and marriage is a picture of Christ's relationship with us as his church, didn't we, some months ago? And we said again and again there that Jesus is not after a dutiful bride, but a devoted bride. Here Jesus is pursuing the delight that comes as a result of being alone with the Father, and that is at the heart of his identity as the Son of God. That's what sonship is. It's the enjoyment of the Father's delight. It has been the experience of God the Son for all eternity. You see, prior to God the Son taking on humanity in the person of Jesus Christ, God the Son has enjoyed the delight of the Father for all eternity. It's what Jesus says in John 17. He says, Father, I desire that they also, his disciples, whom you've given me, may be with me where I am, to see the glory that you have given me, because you loved me before the foundation of the world. What was God doing before creation? Before planets and stars and solar systems and oceans and mountains and forests and rivers? He was a father loving his son, and he was a son enjoying the love of his father. This is something that Jesus has enjoyed for all eternity. And that experience of God's love and delight continues beyond the point at which God the Son takes up humanity and becomes one of us. At his baptism, the Father looks down, as we saw some weeks ago, and says, you are my beloved Son. With you I'm well pleased. Mark 9:7 we'll see in future months, later on the mountain, when Jesus' true identity as God the Son is displayed. This is my beloved Son. Listen to him. So this was Jesus' lived experience. John 3:35, the Father loves the Son. That's Jesus speaking of his lived experience. John 5:20, for the Father loves the Son. You see, when Jesus sneaks out of the house at 4:30 in the morning, he's not doing his duty. He's not ticking off the quiet time box so he can feel good about himself and get on with his day. He is carving out time to enjoy the delight of the Father. Devotion. So let's think about our two questions. Who is Jesus? Well, we need to think a bit about this because he is on the one hand the eternal Son who enjoys the delight of the Father, but he is also the God-man who in the days of his flesh enjoys a lived experience of God's love for him. What does it mean then to follow him? That's our second question on the coin, isn't it, as we look through the Gospel of Mark? Well, it means this incredible thing. It means that for you and me to follow Jesus involves being invited to enjoy a taste of this eternal delight that Jesus has enjoyed for all eternity. As the Father has loved me, Jesus says, so have I loved you in the same way. John 17, Jesus prays, the glory that you've given me, Father, I've given to them that they may be one as we are one. I in them and you in me, that they may become perfectly one, so that the world may know that you sent me and loved them as you loved me. That's what it means to follow Jesus. We get invited in to this deep delight that is the eternal culture, if you like, of the Trinity itself. Jesus is God's Son by what has been described as his eternal generation. But to be a disciple is to be God's son by adoption. And to have the Spirit of God's Son poured into our hearts. So that as adopted sons, you and I get to enjoy a lived experience of God's Son. I mean, what a description of the Christian life. The call to be a disciple is not the call to self-reform. It is not a call to religious duty. It's an invitation to sonship. It's a call to devotion. Maybe you're here this morning wondering, what is a Christian? Curious. And maybe you've come with some ideas that it might be about doing religious things, that while everyone kind of sits in bed on a Sunday morning and has a croissant and a cup of coffee, Christians are about having to go to church and sing Christian songs. I don't know. Well, what Jesus reflects here and what the gospel again and again underlines is that this is all about relationship with God, the Father, through the Son, Jesus Christ. Maybe you're here this morning as a Christian, and if you honestly reflected on your own life as a disciple, there's actually more duty than devotion. Devotion is the first thing we see. Secondly, we find here dependency. Prayer, of course, is an expression of our felt need for God and his intervention and our dependency upon him. And so I think one of the reasons why we can be so resistant to prayer is because if we're honest, we don't actually live with a felt sense of our needs. We live here in the affluent West. I mean, I know we have cost of living crises and we have what you might describe as economic pressures, but we live in the West with a deep sense, not of our own need, but of our own self-sufficiency. We are surrounded by support systems and agencies which we expect to be able to lean on in times of need, and we expect them to deliver what we need in those times of need. If you've ever traveled to the developing world, you will know that's not how most of the world lives. That's not what most of the world expects, because there aren't any support systems. And so our modern Western gospel is a gospel of self-help and social support. That's our good news. The good news is you look inside yourself and you'll find the answer. The good news is if you need help, you lean on social support. That doesn't encourage us to find what we need in God. It doesn't encourage us to live with a sense of our deep dependency on God. Prayer for us is a last resort. It's not the first port of call. Prayer is what we do when everything else fails. Not so for Jesus. For Jesus, time alone with the Father was his very first port of call, as an expression of his dependency. Jesus isn't in a crisis. Things are going pretty well if you hadn't noticed. I mean, there's revival on the streets. I mean, surely Jesus can afford to take a morning off and lie in bed in the afterglow of the revival of the day before. No. He knows that he needs what the Father alone can supply him with. And so whilst he was, as we saw last week, a man on a mission, rolling up his sleeves and being busy about God's kingdom work, his life was not just some great big task list. At times, and here it was before the sun comes up, he is carving out time to express dependency on God. At other times, it was in the evening when he hiked up a hill to pray. Other times, he retreated into his favorite olive grove to be alone with the Father. Jesus took time out to lean into the Father. That's what prayer is. It's when we lean into the Father. And we know the kind of things he prayed, because when his disciples came and asked him to teach them to pray, he gave them what we know as the Lord's Prayer. Not some kind of script that we read out in a religious way, but a scaffold, if you like, a shape, a structure that gives some content and vocabulary to our prayer lives. God's glory and the prayer that his fame would be known, his rule and reign would come, that what he wants would be reflected in our lives and on the earth, that we'd walk in love and unity with the other disciples that he's placed alongside of us, that he'd meet our needs and protect us from evil and empower us to walk in a way that pleases him. These are all ways in which we express our dependency on God in prayer. Jesus was dependent. So who is Jesus? Well, in the light of that, this is an interesting one. Because, of course, on the one hand, he is the eternal God. That means he is essentially all that God is. He is divine in his identity. And that means that he needs nothing. He needs nothing. He is the eternal, self-generating source of all things. For as the Father has life in himself, Jesus said, so he has granted the Son also to have life in himself. So he is the eternal fountain. Yet, in taking humanity to himself and becoming flesh, entering into an authentic human experience, in that act, he willingly embraces all that is meant by living within the very real limits of a human experience. And that's what is involved when Paul says in Philippians 2, though he was in the form of God, He did not count equality with God as something to be grasped, but he emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. He embraced dependency. He needed to seek God's wisdom. Incredible. Didn't just have all the answers. He's laid aside his omniscience. Chosen not to access in the process of living an authentic human experience. And so, as a man, he needs God's wisdom. He needs God's strength and protection and provision. And that's what we find in the Gospels. In Matthew's Gospel, we find of how in an intense time of testing in the wilderness, the angels came and were ministering to him. Think of that. The eternal source of everything is being ministered to in the wilderness at a time of tremendous pressure by the angels. Angels that were created for the glory of God. During his time in Gethsemane praying, we read that an angel appeared to him from heaven, strengthening him. I mean, it's incredible. This is the omnipotent God, the one from whom all strength comes, receiving strength through a ministering spirit, an angel. And so Hebrews speaks in this way, that in the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverence. Ever prayed with loud cries? Ever prayed with tears? Well, that's how Jesus prayed in the days of his flesh. These are the prayers of someone who has a desperate, deep felt sense of their dependency on God. Despite being the creator of the angels and the object of their adoration, he needs them to come and strengthen him. Despite being the eternal fountain from which all life flows, he needs to come and drink. And so the question for us is this: if Jesus felt the need to express deep dependency on God in prayer, with loud cries and with tears, do you think perhaps that you and I need to do the same? I'll pray, last resort. I'll try this, I'll try that. If it doesn't work out, I'll find a verse, I'll take 5 minutes and I'll pray. Dependency. So what does it mean to follow him? Well, it means to live a life marked by this dependency. And in many ways, prayer is the measure of our dependency, which is why Martin Luther said, it's no more possible to be alive without breathing than it is to be a Christian without praying. The disciples, of course, recognized this. And that's why they came to him and asked him to teach them not how to preach or heal the sick or cast out demons. They said, Lord, teach us to pray. Teach us how to pray. That's why in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus speaks of how they are to go into their room and shut their door and pray to their Father who sees in secret. And that's why we find them after Jesus has returned to the Father, gathering in an upper room, not to have a nice party and food together, although they did eat together. That's a good thing. but in order to pray. And throughout the record of the book of Acts, we find again and again and again that alongside wonderful gospel breakthrough on the streets, in public, in new towns and regions, there is behind closed doors a church community that prays. Sorry, I'm getting passionate about this. Dependency. Is that your lived experience? Is prayer a last resort, or is it your first port of call? If it's a duty, it will be your last resort. But if there is within you, by the grace of the Holy Spirit, a desire birthed in your heart to know intimacy with the Father, it will become your first port of call. One final thing, direction. Mark goes on to record this account, in his account, the record of the way that sometime later, once the disciples have had their beauty sleep and woken up, that they discover that Jesus is missing. His bed is empty. His blanket is folded up nicely on the end of his bed. You do know that Jesus folded up his bedclothes in the morning, don't you? Yeah? We know that. How? Well, we know that after the resurrection, the women saw the grave clothes neatly folded up. And so if Jesus neatly folds up his grave clothes after he's risen from the dead, you can be sure that he neatly folded up his bedclothes after he woke up from natural sleep. Sorry, I'm slightly tongue-in-cheek here. And so the disciples see these bedclothes folded up and his bed empty, and they probably think to themselves that, well, he's just doing what most people do at that time of day. He's having his toileting time. Time ticks by, and Jesus doesn't appear. By this time, people are arriving at the door. They've heard about what happened the day before. Maybe some of them have actually slept on the streets outside so they wouldn't miss anything spectacular happening the following day. And news is spreading. People are hearing about this Jesus of Nazareth. Crowds are beginning to gather, and Jesus is nowhere to be found. And so they begin looking for him. And eventually, they find him out in the countryside praying. And I bet they're probably quite annoyed at this stage, beginning to feel something of the pressure of the expectation of the crowds, beginning perhaps to be aware of the opportunities that are there and the moment that we mustn't miss. And where is Jesus? Feeling the pressure of the crowds as people with some very, very real needs are once again asking for Jesus. Sick people, oppressed people. And what happens next? Jesus says these words to them. He says, sorry guys, we're just going to have to move on to some other towns now that also need to hear. And that's why I got up so early and came out here. It's a strange thing. But that's exactly what happens. Jesus is directed by the Father. And he is not driven by the crowds or the needs that are gathering on his doorstep. Now, if it was you or me, we would have immediately, I think, just hired the biggest hall in Capernaum. I mean, this is what we're praying for all our lives. It's here. It's revival. God's at work. We'd have hired the biggest hall in town and we'd have started a conference. Because that's what we do when we sense God is at work. That's where we need to be. And if revival's breaking out, we mustn't miss it. We think to ourselves, let's ride this wave until it reaches the shore. I mean, we've only just begun to scratch the surface of the needs. There's so much more to be done. There's so much more opportunity. There's so much more that we want to see happen in Capernaum. Not so with Jesus. Alone in the countryside, in the place of prayer, he hears the Father's whisper. Just move on, son. Move on to the next town. And that's what he does. He leaves the vast needs. He leaves the opportunities. He moves on from revival. He is living out of the Father's direction. This is how he puts it in John 5. Truly, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of his own accord, but only what he sees the Father doing. Who is Jesus? Well, he is the obedient Son who only does what he sees the Father doing. In his humanity, he surrenders to the Father's goodwill, God's agenda. Even when ultimately, of course, that would involve the agony and the humiliation of the cross. You know that prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, Father? If it's at all possible, please not this cup. Yet, not what I want, but what you want. Jesus is driven by the desire to please and obey God, rather than popularity, rather than position, rather than fame, rather than fortune. And that is one of the themes of Mark's gospel. The way that Jesus deliberately, intentionally refuses to be put up on a pedestal. I mean, he's commanding demons to be quiet, not to tell anyone. At times, he commands people not to tell other people who he is. He resists the attempts to make him king. He embodies a deep humility and he pursues obedience rather than notoriety or fame. So what does it mean for us to follow him? Well, it means you and I have got to do what we see the Father doing. It means you and I must resist the temptation to chase after the crowds, to give the crowds what the crowds want, to say the things that the crowds want to hear. No. We've got to do what we see the Father doing. And we also, at times, need to not be driven by the needs that are vast all around us. Somebody put it this way: the need does not constitute the call. So our question is first and foremost, not how can we be successful, how can we gather a bigger crowd, or even how can we meet more needs, but what is the Father calling us to do? I wonder how you'd answer that question this morning. Just take a moment to think about that. What is the Father calling you to do? For Jesus, that meant at times leaving the crowds, not meeting the expectations of others, not being driven by those pressures. Like Philip, who leaves the revival in Samaria to share the gospel with one Ethiopian eunuch. So here we get underneath the surface of Jesus' ministry and mission. We find devotion, dependency, and direction. Let me ask you, how about you? Is your life marked by time alone with the Father? Not out of duty, but devotion. Are you living with a deep sense of dependency on God and expressing that in prayer? Are you living in a way that's directed by God or driven by the needs of others or the desire to please the crowds. Let me finish with just 3 very practical things, because if I've achieved anything, you'll be sitting there wanting to spend more time with the Father. 3 very practical things, and I think sometimes we don't have the prayer life that we would like to have because of some very practical reasons. So what 3 things can you do this coming week, this coming month? First of all, schedule in some time. If you don't know in the coming week when you're intending to be alone with the Father, probably won't happen. Probably won't happen. You might snatch 5 minutes here or there in between the other important things that you do have scheduled into your diary. But it probably won't happen. For Jesus here, on this occasion, it was first thing in the morning. Schedule in some time. That's practical. Second thing, find somewhere where you won't be disturbed. For Jesus, it was out in the desolate place. No people there. No smartphones there. No distractions there. Just a desolate place, me and the Father. Jesus said, didn't he, when you pray, go into your room and close the door behind you and pray to your Father who sees in secret. Put down your phone. Find somewhere conducive to focus one-on-one time with the Father. I mean, Jesus is living in a culture, by the way, but then they had no sense of personal, private space. So if you're struggling to find that kind of space, and I appreciate in the busyness of life, and particularly with young family, it can be a challenge, but we need just to find help from God to creatively find a space where we won't be disturbed. And then thirdly, if needed, use some scaffolding. Adopt a structure. And if there is a will, a desire in you, I tell you, it will take you 5 to 10 minutes to find all sorts of online resources to help in this. Adopt a structure, maybe the Lord's Prayer. I've used that myself at times in my Christian life, praying through habitually the structure, if you like, of the Lord's Prayer, developing a rhythm, deliberately developing. Maybe praying through the Psalms. There's enough there for 149 days to get you started. Maybe praying through the prayers of the New Testament. Why are they there? Well, partly to help us adopt the vocabulary of prayer and pray for things that the apostles prayed for. And like I said, plenty of online options. The Lectio 365 app, I think it's called, that the folk from the prayer movement, 24/7 prayer, have developed. Let's pray.